In this video we're going to take a quick look at the AD Permissions Reporter tool that's just been released. This is just going to be a quick demonstration of what the program can do and a general overview of the purpose of the program. We'll go into more detail in other videos on some of the more advanced features, but for now let's just take a look at what the program can do and what the purpose of it is. Alright, hopefully this is a screen that most people watching this are familiar with. Here's Active Directory users and computers, so we can see all of the objects in our domain. And each of these objects has permissions associated with it that determine who can do what to each object. So if we look at this domain controller, for example, if we go to the security tab, we can see who is allowed to perform certain actions. So if we look at authenticated users, they're allowed to read this set of properties. And there's lots more permissions that you can see if you go into the advanced view. So it's fine having these permissions granted, but there's no easy way to actually query where certain users have got certain permissions, or which objects are inheriting permissions from the parent container or OU. All sorts of things like that are very hard to actually find out without manually going through and right-clicking on each object and going to security, as we've done here. But another problem with the built-in Windows tools is that if we go to the advanced view, we can see there's quite a few permissions entries where it simply doesn't show you which permission has been granted. So if we actually double-click on that, there's no ticks in any of the boxes, so there's no way for us to know what permission is actually being allowed for this particular group. So the organization management group is allowed to do something to this container, but we don't know what. So this tool was created to help fill those gaps, basically, to allow you to quickly find out where a particular permission has been used or who's got certain permissions on certain types of objects, and also just to give you an actual detailed view that shows all of the permissions rather than missing some of them out. So if we go ahead and launch the program, so like I said, we'll go through each of the features in depth in other videos, but for now let's just run a report on the entire domain, just showing all permissions, so we'll see absolutely everything. Obviously you'd normally want to narrow this down a bit more so that you're not seeing some of the advanced objects and things like that, but like I say, for this example we'll just do absolutely everything. So now that the report's finished, you'll see that we get a similar view to AD users and computers. We've obviously got all of the containers and organizational units. So if we go ahead and take a look at the computers container and look at the permissions on there, we get a nice quick summary of exactly who's got what permissions. So we can see there the everyone group is being denied permission to delete child objects. And if we go back and look in Active Directory, we'll see that exact same permission, so deny delete child objects. And again, we would see that there in the advanced view. But as I mentioned before, some of the other permissions are not shown at all. So this Exchange servers group, we've got no idea what permissions actually been granted, but if we go and look in here, we can see where the Exchange servers group's been used. So it's these two entries here. These SIDs here that are just showing as SIDs rather than display names, they're basically accounts that have been deleted or can't be retrieved. So they're either from another domain that's not online at the moment, or they're accounts that no longer exist. And using the filtering option, which we'll go into in a separate video, you could actually just run a report that only finds these kind of objects where an account can't be resolved to its name, and so the account's probably been deleted. So as well as viewing the report in a tree view like this, we can also go into a table view. If we just generate that from the tree view, and that gives us a slightly different layout. Some people might prefer this view. Scroll down and view each object and all of the permissions associated with it. There are several more columns that we can add as well. But again, it's all the same information that's shown in the tree view, it's just a different layout. The errors that we're seeing here are basically for accounts that don't exist any longer, or for a domain that can't be contacted at the moment, because it's got to try and go and get information about each account that's being granted permission. But if the domain where that account lives isn't available at the moment, then obviously there's not a lot the program can do. So in that case, it'll just show a SID, as we're seeing here. So now that we've run a very basic report just on the entire domain, let's look at some of the options that we can use to narrow things down a bit more. Obviously we can choose which domain we want to query. It'll pre-populate that with the list of domains that it finds in your forest and in your externally trusted domain list. We can also set credentials if you don't want to use the current user's credentials. And these options here, group policy, if we run the group policy report, basically automatically locates the group policy container within your domain and just purely reports on the group policy objects. So you could achieve a very similar result by manually browsing to the group policy container. So if we go into system policies, we would end up with a similar result, but you also get sub-objects and things like that. So this is just a nice quick way to view permissions on group policies only. The custom option is for if you don't want to actually report on domain objects. Instead, you want to report on, say, the schema or the configuration partition, something like that. So that's probably something that not a lot of people will need to use, but the option is there just in case. Most people are just going to need to use the domain objects and either run it against the entire domain or choose a particular OU or object, and then set which kind of child objects you want to be included in the results. So if we were to set this to the computers container and set it to not include child objects, then obviously we'll only see permissions for the computer container itself. We can set a certain level, so if we wanted to do the actual root of the domain, but only, say, one level down for each subcontainer, we can do that, and then obviously it makes the report a lot quicker, but you can't drill down any further than one level. So even though a lot of these OUs have got sub-OUs within them, we're only seeing the first level of subcontainers. Moving along, we've got the filtering options, which again we'll go into in more detail in other videos, but for now let's just take a quick look at a simple filter. So this is to only find deny permissions. So by default it would show all permissions, but if we untick allow, then we're only going to see deny permissions. So if we use that filter and run this again on the entire domain, so now we only see permissions where someone's actually been denied a permission. If we load that into table view, it's a bit easier to see in that particular format. The options over here, we can choose to show group members directly within the report. So I'll just go and take that filter off. So now that we've enabled that option and run the reports, we can see that for any groups that the members can be gathered from, we can expand them and see the members directly within there. So enterprise admins, we can see that administrator is the only member. Exchange servers, we can see there's just this particular computer and the group. But if we wanted to see who was a member of that group, so who's indirectly a member of this group, we can just tick get nested group members, run the report again. So we can see now if we expand a group that's got another group within it, we can see the nested members that are a member of this group that are then a member of the group that's actually used in the permissions. So that gives you complete visibility over who's been granted or denied a particular permission. We can also tick get primary members, but for most people every user is just going to have domain users as their primary group. So it's usually fairly safe to assume that wherever you see domain users, that just means everyone. But obviously if you want to make sure, then you can use that option. Object owners, if we tick that option, we will see, so see now for every object that we click on, we can see who owns it. This icon here, as it tells us in the tooltip, just means that this particular object is not inheriting permissions from its parent. So you'll see that all the permissions on it are not inherited, which is what this icon symbolises. You see down here, inherited no. If we look at another object where it's not got that icon, then they will have a mixture of inherited and not inherited permissions. So that's quite useful just to give you a quick idea from looking down the list, just to see which containers or user accounts are not inheriting permissions. So once you've run your report and got the exact results that you wanted, we can go to the Import and Export tab and export it to various formats. If we just export to Excel for now. So now we can see we've got a few options to dictate how the export is going to look and exactly which information is going to be exported. So we can choose different columns that we want to be exported, but we can also tick the option to show group members on a separate sheet, which is quite helpful if you've got a large amount of members of some of your groups. So if we do that, click OK, we'll just save it as an example. Let that export. So now if we take a look at that file, you see it tells us about the options that were specified for the report. There is an option to not have any of this information exported, so it just purely starts with the results straight away. And you can see we get the report results in table format, with permissions highlighted according to their severity. And you can also see that any groups are hyperlinks, and if we click on them, it will take us to the part in the separate sheet that lists the members of those groups. So you can see because we ticked to get nested and direct members, we can see some nested groups here, and we can see which group they came from within the other group. And again, if we look at some other ones, if we look at Exchange Windows permissions, it will take us directly to that location that shows the members of those groups. So again, that's quite useful. If we didn't tick that option, then instead of these being hyperlinks, we would just see each member separately listed out on their own row directly within the report, rather than on a separate sheet. So that's what the export format looks like when you export to Excel. The HTML and CSV formats are very similar. but they don't have the option to show group members separately. They will always be shown just directly within the report itself. The ADPR file is a custom file format just for this program. So if we export to this, just call it anything. Now what we can do is if we close the program and then open it up at a later date, or just double click on the file, we will see that it loads that report back in. So now we can see the exact same results without having to run another report. It will also include any errors that were generated at the time the report was run, so you can see if there were any problems. And it will have the exact same information that you saw when you actually ran the report. So you can see all the group members and everything is still intact. And if we click on any of the items, we can still see all the details. So that's quite useful if you want to just run a report and then examine it at a later date, or give it to a colleague for them to look at. That's quite a useful feature. The command line options we'll go into in a separate video, but it's fairly straightforward. You essentially choose your settings in here, so it's all easy to use and all done in the GUI. And then just click OK, and that will export an XML file for you that you can then pass into the command line version of the program. But again, we'll go through that in a lot of detail in another video. So that's it for this brief tour of the program. I hope you like the look of what you've seen. You can find out more information on the website, which I'll provide a link to in the description. And like I say, I'll be doing separate videos on the filtering capabilities and the command line function. So be sure to check those out as well if you're interested in that. Until then, goodbye.